Welcome everyone to today's virtual training class. My name is John Weber. I'll be your host and coordinator. I have with me today Tyler Lindsay, who's one of our technical applications consultants who will be teaching today's class. I also have Mark Holback and Wynn Worrell in the background who will be working the Q&A to answer questions during the presentation and also afterwards as needed. People always ask, okay, the software Tyler's using, what do you need to run it? Well, that's here on the screen. The operating system, Windows 7, 8, 10, various server OSs, DA and UA data sources, and then a variety of different storage destinations that you can use. So just want to get that out of the way. Obviously, this will be in the recording as well. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Tyler, and let me switch presenters. And Tyler will take the class from here. And you are receiving the presenter ball, Tyler. All right, sir, take it away.
All right, well, thank you, John. First of all, I want to start off and say thank you to everybody for coming. Again, my name is Tyler Lindsay, and I'm part of the technical team here at Software Toolbox. And what I'm going to be teaching today is how to take data from an OPC data source using the OPC DataLogger and log to something called Azure Hosted SQL. Now, as you can see on my right here, we have kind of a diagram of a basic DataLogger project structure in its totality. I'll go into more detail on how the DataLogger itself is configured a little bit later and be certain to answer your questions. But to start off with, I want to give a brief overview of everything that we need to understand before going in. So starting off with, we need our project component. So the OPC DataLogger, as we said earlier, is three primary components to building it. We need an OPC compliant data source. In this case, it can be a DA or UA server, as you saw earlier, either DA 2.0 or 3.0, or an equivalent UA compliant server. But for today's examples, I'm going to actually be using the top server, which is, in this case, an OPC UA server for our test. The DataLogger itself, obviously, there's a lot of features on the DataLogger that enable you plenty of functionality in terms of how you want to log your data, obviously where you want to log your data, how you want to partition it, and how you want to store it. And then finally, the data storage location itself. So as you can see in the top right, and again, as John mentioned earlier, you can use text files or a variety of databases such as SQL, MySQL, ODBC Access, or also Oracle via the ODBC plugin. But today we're actually going to focus on Azure Hosted SQL. And one of the things that we need going in is first we need the server URL. So in order to get that, a couple steps you need to follow through. First, you need to be able to sign in to your Azure Cloud via the login portal. You're able to find this on google.com. Just look up Microsoft Azure Sign-In, and as long as you've configured an Azure profile, you should have your username and password available to you. Second, once you're actually in the home screen for Azure, you're going to be presented with a list of modules, and you need to actually click on the All Resources module under the Navigate option. It's going to be on the lower half of your screen, and All Resources is going to pull up a list of everything that you currently have configured in Azure. So for our example, I've actually already set up an Azure database, and so for yourself, you would need to have one set up, and you would then see it in the All Resources list. Finally, once you select that database, you'll be presented with a screen. A lot of information on it related to your database, but the important thing that we're going to grab from it today is the server URL. And so as you can see here, here's our example database. I've grayed out a lot of things, but you should be able to get the general idea of what your SQL database home screen looks like. And then in the top right over in the red, you can see that we actually have the server URL itself. So you're going to need to copy that before we go anywhere with this presentation, with this training, if you're following along. Otherwise, for those of you watching and recording, this is the key component to have for your Azure database. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and now jump into the actual configuration part of this training, and I'll show you how to set up the DataLogger. I'll show you what the top server looks like in this case, and I will show you how everything plays out on Azure via SQL Server Management Studio. So we'll go ahead. So we'll start off first with the DataLogger. Obviously, we've got ourselves an empty project here. Nothing really to see aside from a couple of the modules, but you can already get an idea of how this is going to be constructed. Obviously, we have our collection, which is going to be the top server. We have our tasks, and eventually into that, we're going to have our groups, which is just a collection of items that we're interested in reading. And then data storage is our key component here, and that's going to be Azure. We continue from there. I'm actually going to pull up the top server as well. Again, we have a project that's currently running, and I'm actually communicating with an S7 PLC and grabbing some live data. So just to show you what that looks like, I'm going to pull up the quick client, just a sample client for this example. And then once that starts polling, you can see now that we have live data, a couple Booleans, 4 floats. We'll be digging into those a little bit later. And then finally, we need the Azure component. So I will pull up SSMS here. And as you can see, again, the information that you see at the top there, that's our server URL that we grabbed earlier. And once you've configured that on the Azure side, you're going to need to have, obviously, a login and password. But to do that, all you need to do is when you pull up SQL Server Management Studio, enter the server name, set the authentication level for SQL Server authentication, and then input your relevant user information. Now, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start actually building the DataLogger project itself. So as you can see here, like I said earlier, it's broken down into a series of modules, and they all relate to how this project will look at the end, where it's going to go, and what the data is coming from. But for those of you who might be new users, you're looking at this and saying, well, where do I start? Well, luckily, if you've been paying attention, you can see over here in the blue, there are a series of wizards indicated by the blue text, little one at the side, and they'll guide you through constructing each of these modules. Now, you can choose to use a wizard after you've constructed a module later on, but for your first run, all these are going to be empty, and all these modules are available for wizards. But what we're going to do is start off with a logging task, and the reason why will become clear in a moment. So again, just welcome to the DataLogger, and we're going to start off with the logging task wizard. Think of a logging task as an umbrella. Underneath this umbrella, you're going to set up what are called groups. They're collections of data, and this is just the broad grouping of that data. A logging task, again, can be assigned its own name. So we'll call it test task during our first run. And again, for larger projects, you can set something up that is more descriptive of the data that you're collecting. I highly recommend this for projects that become larger. I'm going to leave this blank for now just because we're going to do something very simple today. And now we get to the first part where we're going to step outside the task and actually configure our collector. So as I said earlier, the logging task wizard is great to start off with because everything folds into it. So that's what I would suggest you start off with. And as you can see, we currently don't have a data collector configured, but we do have the option to start one from this wizard. So we're going to do that. Again, we're presented with another pop-up. It cascades. And as you can see, we do support OPC UA and OPC DA. Now, if I wanted to use OPC DA, and again, I'm going to breeze through this for now, but the options that we need, obviously, set up a name for your collector, set up the IP address where the server resides, and then pick the server from the drop-down. Now, I'm not going to be using DA for this example, but as you can see, it is certainly an option if you're interested in using it. Now, for today's demonstration, like I said, we're going to stick with UA. We're going to call it the top server. Very simple, descriptive, short, probably ideal for most industrial scenarios. Make sure it's descriptive and short, easy to read. We hit next, we're presented with another screen. Now we have, if you're familiar with UA, then you've probably heard of the discovery URL. It's basically a location where a list of server IPs are stored. We're not interested in that today. We don't have one set up. Instead, we're going to connect directly to the top server. Now, like I said, I've got it stored locally or running locally on my machine. So you'll just need to put the server IP in there. One moment. If we hit Get Security Modes, once you've entered the server IP, it's going to pull up a drop-down list showing you what server is currently configured on the endpoint. Now, as you can see from the drop-down, I don't actually have anything set up right now. We're going to go with a very simple, no user authentication, no encryption connection, just for ease of use. But as you can see, user authentication is an option. And if you're interested in learning more about UA server security as it relates to endpoints, we have several white papers that we can provide for you if you're interested. But from here, we're just going to go ahead and hit next. And if we hit finish, we're done with that portion. Now, as you can see, maybe on the left-hand side over here, There's currently not anything showing up as we go. That's because for a new user, we want them to walk through the whole process, build the whole project out via wizards, and then once they're done, everything will populate on the left-hand side. That being said, now we want to go ahead and add items. We have our connection to the server. We want to start grabbing data. I'm going to leave this as group. I think that's sufficiently descriptive for this example, but I do encourage, again, users using larger projects to give them a name that's descriptive and, again, a description, maybe providing a little bit more detail about the whole system. We hit next here. You'll be presented with a list of ways that we can read data. Now, this is going to be important later on. I'm not going to go into these too much right now, but again, we recommend subscription-based reads. If you're familiar with OPC, a subscription-based read is a report by exception read method, where we negotiate an interval with the OPC server, that's there, the 250 milliseconds, where we say we'd like an update every quarter second if there's been a change in value. If there hasn't been, then those items simply won't be pushed to the data logger. But if there has, then we'll be updated with new information. Timer-based reads work a little differently. You still set up that interval in which you want to pull the OPC server, but in this case, we're asking for everything every time we hit one of those intervals, regardless of whether or not there's been a change in value. And finally, triggered reads are reads that use outside conditions to initiate a log. They use triggers in this case, obviously, pretty simply described. We'll get into those a little bit later because there's a lot you can do with triggers, not just trigger reads. But we're going to stick with subscription-based reads for this example. Now, if you hit next, and finally, we get to start browsing our server and selecting our data. Again, DataLogger supports importing from text files, auto-importing everything from the server, or manually choosing items. I've got a fair amount going on this server, so I just want to go ahead and pick the tags I'm interested in. So we're going to go with manually choose items. And as you can see here, this is what our group configuration window looks like. So there's nothing here at the moment, but if I click on add and browse for items, as long as your server supports browsing, you'll see a list of everything that's currently available on the OPC server. So as you can see from earlier, I have my Siemens PLC that's currently connected to top server. And if I click on S7, the group folder where all this information is stored, I have a list of about 6 tags. Well, earlier I said there's a couple booleans in there, so I'm going to leave those alone. But I am going to go ahead and grab these 4 float tags. Now, as you saw there, all I did was a quick shift click. But once you've selected either singularly and adding, or shift clicking, or control clicking, whatever hotkey method you like to use, once you hit add selected, it keeps everything over on the right-hand side in what's called an adding list. If you hit OK, you now see that those items have been added to our group. So that's good. Shows that we've got everything that we wanted, no issues. And I'm going to go ahead and give these user-defined names. Item IDs in OPC can become long, but we can make this a little bit more concise, nicer to look at in our database later. This will come into play a little later. So we're going to go ahead and name these. Call this one flow rate. Again, I'm just going ahead and naming them based off of the last little text blob at the end of the item ID. And then tank volume. Now, if we hit next, again, we've given these nice user-defined names, very pretty to look at, and hit finish. Now our group is configured. So finally, we're going to get into a little bit more interesting part. We're going to start talking about logging to Azure. So if you're new to the data logger, as I said earlier, you can log to a ton of different data storage locations. So during the wizard, you're presented with a drop-down list. Again, you have access, not to be redundant, Microsoft or MySQL, ODBC, Oracle through ODBC, SQL Server, and finally logging to a text file. So for us, we're going to go with SQL Server. Now, bear in mind, it's going to take just a second because when you select SQL Server, the data logger is actually looking for local servers, something on your network. And so it's going to browse for a little bit there and think. But once it's done looking, it's satisfied. And again, you should see searching for names of computers on the network. So it's satisfied with that. We're going to go ahead and give this a name. I'm just going to call this AzureSQL. Simple enough. If we hit next, now we get into one of the final steps, and that's setting up a presentation. And I promise this will all come together and it'll look great at the end, but there are several steps to follow just to make sure that it's all wrapped up at the very end. So presentation style, probably one of the most important things to remember when you're logging to SQL is how you want this to be structured. So there are two types of presentations in the OPC DataLogger. There's table mode and there's detail mode. Table mode is what you would expect on something like a text file or a CSV. And in fact, that's why we created it. It's designed so that, as you can see in these rows and columns, we have one column that's a timestamp and another one that's set to a tag name. And these are just the headers, mind you. Underneath that is the actual information. So at 9 o'clock in this example, we logged 1, 10, 100, 1,000 for tags 1 through 4. Now that's great if you want something that's wide, but it's not going to provide you a lot of information about the data point at the time, because the only options when you're logging to a table mode presentation style are timestamp and which tags you're interested in logging. Whereas detail mode is what we suggest for logging to databases such as SQL, so in this case AzureSQL, because you can specify how wide you want the column to be, and the width of the column is, or the width of the table, rather, number of columns in the table, is determined by what information about a tag you're interested in. So to make this a little bit more simple, you see we can log tag name, value, quality, and timestamp. And this shows the conditions of the tag at the specific time it was logged. And you'll see a little bit later once we do some successful logging what that looks like. But like I said, we're going to stick with detail because it's better suited for something like SQL. It's a little bit more narrow, table setup. It's easier to find everything. So we'll hit next. Detail presentation. I think that works for me. Just making sure that the user is aware that this is a detail style presentation. Hit next. And now we actually get to build our presentation. What's it going to look like? So automatically add the pictured columns. Again, that just gives us tag, value, quality, timestamp. So I think that's good. We'll hit next. And here you can actually start configuring what columns how many columns you're going to have and what you want each attribute to be. So as you can see, I have on the left here these 4 columns enabled. And earlier I set up user-defined item IDs. So I'd kind of like to see that in the SQL table. You know, having that long item ID can be a little cumbersome. So if we scroll down, we actually have the option here to select what we want these attributes to be or where we want the pull from. And again, I can choose to add more, but for this presentation, I'm going to go ahead and stick with just the basic 4 that we've got set up. One of the nice things is that you can actually also choose what format string you want for these values. So something like timestamp, if you want 12-hour versus 24-hour time, is an option. Whether you just want to go ahead and use daily logs is also an option. I'm going to leave this at the default, which is to say year, month, day. Again, year denoted with 4 characters, month with 2, day with 2, obviously, and then hour, minute, second, millisecond. If we hit next, hit finish, we've finished our presentation, we've finished our collector, we've finished our task and group. Now we need to go ahead and actually get connected to Azure. We need to set it as the destination. So as you can see here, this is where that server URL is finally coming in handy. You'll go ahead and just enter that from earlier. So the one key component to I here is that if you've been keenly paying attention, the one addition that we are making on the DataLogger side is you need to include a TCP colon in front of the server URL. That's very important to remember. It basically instructs the DataLogger on letting it know that this is something shared on the cloud. But once we have that, we need to input our database name. Now that wasn't showcased earlier in the slides, but what our database is called in this case is just SWTB, or Software Toolbox, -DataLogger -testing. So again, make sure to avoid any typos here. We'll hit next. And we get to specify the credentials that we need to log in. So in this case, we'll use database login. For those of you who are a little bit more familiar with the DataLogger, if you're aware, integrated security just means Windows security. You know, if you're logged in as a user or you specify a service to run as a user, when you try to connect to a database, it's going to use that. But we want to use database login because our SQL service hosted in the cloud, it doesn't care who I am. It cares about what its credentials are. So we're going to go ahead and obviously I'm cheating a little bit because I'm copying, but you can key it in if you're so interested. Again, make sure that your information is correct, no typos, what have you. Hit next, and now we test our connection. We see that it's good, we like that. And finally, we get to build our table or pick one. So as I showed you earlier in SQL Server Management Studio, we don't actually have any tables configured. And normally, if you're, probably used a logging solution before, you like to have that table made. It sets everything up, and then you just map what tags you want or what information you want to go where. Well, one of the big advantages of the DataLogger, as you can see here, it's not necessarily concealed because we're very happy with it, is you can build a table within the DataLogger itself, and everything will be all automatically mapped for you. But if you do have one configured, you can pick from the drop-down menu. However, like I said, I don't have anything configured, so I'm going to build it. I'm going to do it on air. Now, as you can see already, the big advantage of building this presentation is that you can actually take the presentation that you made and construct the table in SQL to mirror that. And when you do so, if I hit go here, you can see now that we have all of those items that we configured earlier, and they're mapped out into a SQL table. It's automatically going to put a table index in there, and I would suggest leaving that as the identity seed. But from here, we just simply give it a name, live demo. And then if you have something that's maybe going to be a bit wider, like I said earlier, I set up a user-defined name for those item IDs. But say I was just logging the item ID. As you saw, it's pretty long. Perhaps you want to widen it out. You have the option to widen your table columns here. But everything is satisfactory for this table, so I'm going to go ahead and make table. And now it appears in the drop-down list. Hit next. And now this is where I was talking about earlier. If you were connecting to a table that already existed, and you had a presentation mode that kind of corresponded to it, but wasn't built within the DataLogger, you'd actually have to go through here and map the field names to the item attributes. And I can maybe show how that would work later. But for example, under field name, these are obviously already done because we generated it, but you would have to then map a field name to timestamp, user-defined name, value, quality, etc. And once that's done, you hit validate, seems okay. You hit next, finish, and then everything cascades through, finished, and voila, we have a fully functioning project over here on the left. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And what we're going to do now is a test run. Again, I'll show you just with the quick client, still getting updates to the data, quality's still good. We hit test run, you'll be presented with just a confirmation sheet, making you aware that we are going to log data to your system, it's live, and just go ahead and hit confirm all to acknowledge everything. Then we hit OK. And there we go. We've started logging data. Now, the test run is, you can stop it. It doesn't have to run for a full 5 minutes. Obviously, you guys are already here to watch me teach long enough, but a couple seconds should suffice. Again, as you saw on the quick client, data is changing pretty frequently, so we don't need that much information. Now hit stop test. Test run completed. That's good. Disconnecting from database. Again, when we're not logging data either through a test run or runtime, we disconnect from the database. And let's take a look at what that looks like. We'll expand this again. And this time under tables, you can see the live demo is made, so we're looking good already. And if you right click on that, select top 1,000 rows, or if you're so inclined, write a query. And as you can see, all of the values are being logged. And they have the table index, which is automatic, the tag timestamp, user-defined name, which we set up, tag name, and quality. So quality 0 is just good. It's just represented as a numeric. So pretty simple, right? I think we can go ahead and minimize this for now. But as I said earlier, I was going to talk about something called triggers. So this is where some of the really interesting and user configurable aspects can come in. So as you can see, I didn't configure these in a basic setup, and you normally will not be asked to, or rather you won't be asked to make a trigger during your first build through. They're considered a little bit more advanced, but they're not super complicated. So let's kind of get into what each of these do. But on its face, if you're familiar with a trigger in a colloquial sense, you know that it fires when a condition is met. So a scheduled trigger, it actually leverages the Windows scheduler to fire, and it'll launch the trigger itself. So as you can see, I've got a scheduled job in here, And if I hit properties, I'll actually pull up and see how it's laid out. I'm not going to go into all of the details here because we're mostly focusing on Azure, but I do want to talk about the main portion, which is the triggers action and when it fires. So as you can see, I've disabled this for now because we're not interested in using a scheduled trigger today. But if I double click on that condition or that outcome, you can see the time frame for which it should fire. And again, you can set it for one time only, weekly, monthly. A lot of customers that I've worked with in the past typically use a scheduled trigger when they want to stop logging at the end of the day. Say you're running a 9 to 5, and they want to stop gathering information at 5 p.m. because everybody's going home. They can do that from here, or at least this is one part of that process. Alternatively, if you have a production environment where you're running 3 shifts and you want to make sure you track data accurately per shift, it's another way to do that. Recurring triggers, not necessarily like scheduled triggers because they fire on intervals. So again, you can set it to milliseconds, seconds, minutes. It's not one that people typically use, but it is nice if you want something to, let's say you want to log to a text file and you want every 5 minutes or so to generate a new text file and start logging data to that 5-minute block. You can do that here. I can explain the application of how later, but just remember that a recurring trigger will fire every time its condition is met, which is to say every time a certain amount of time elapses. The final one is going to be monitored items. So monitored items are very useful when you have a system that, well, like the one I'm going to show you today, where you actually want to receive instructions from the PLC on when to log something. So let's take a look at what I mean by that. With the monitor item, obviously there's a tag on the OPC server, and when a condition is met, we want this trigger to fire. So for me, if we go back, and you can start setting this up yourself either by manually entering the monitored items ID or hitting browse. So we'll hit browse because we're familiar with this interface. And we'll go back to our Siemens PLC from earlier. We actually have some logic on this PLC where one of our Boolean tags will go high or become true when we are ready to log, hence the data ready option. I hit that and then hit OK. So now you can see that that's the item that we're interested in watching. And the operator, we don't really have any and or conditions that we're setting up, but we do want it to be equals. And we want it to be true. This is a Boolean tag. And if you're going to use a Boolean tag, you need to denote the value as being true. So call this data ready. And hit OK. And now you see we have our monitor item set up. Well, as I said earlier, there are 2 Booleans there. And what's the second one for? The corresponding logic is that we want to write back to this PLC and say, I got your trigger. It was high. Data successfully been logged to Azure. And now I want you to go ahead and initiate another log. Sounds complicated. Very simple, though, with something called a write back. And that one's a little bit more concealed. But as you can see, there's a little bit more meat to this. Obviously, a monitored item, you pick your item, your trigger condition, and save. Whereas this, there's a couple things we can do and a couple items we can write back to. I only want to write back to one, though. So let's go again, browse, Siemens PLC, load that list of tags, and data logged. Add selected and hit OK. And what value do we want to write back? Well, we want to write it back to, we want to write this one to be 1. So bearing in mind that both these Booleans are separate, and you may see triggers here. We don't need to set a trigger in this write back. Instead, what we want to do, I'll show you, is first things first, we're going to go back to our Azure SQL data storage, open that up. And one of the really neat features of the data logger is that you can set a write back without a trigger necessarily. You can set a write back to activate once a log has been successful. As you can see over here, all of our information is stored from earlier, obviously. But clicking on write backs, we can then select the one that we just configured. Write back 1. and we have a couple options of what we want the write back to be caused by. So if I hit this drop down here, I want it to write a 1 to that Boolean every time a log has been successful. We hit OK. That then saves it. And the last thing we want to do is we want to change our group from being a subscription-based log to a trigger-based log. To do that, we go back to the group, double-clicking it to open up properties, selecting triggered reads, and then adding our monitored item trigger from earlier. One-shot read now is our effect. As you can see, we have a lot of other options in here, but we're going to focus on one-shot read now for this example. We hit OK, and then we save. So we'll go ahead, and I'm going to pull up the quick client again, just to show you what these tags look like. And again, we got to start pulling them. So you can see the data ready is already a 1. So what we're going to do is once this starts, I'm actually going to write this back to a 0 because the trigger will fire on data change. So just important acknowledgement there. Let's initiate this test run, hit OK. Now we're going to write this to 0. 1 moment. Okay. Thought it was a string. It's a very important thing to remember. A string, obviously, it can be a numeric, but the OPC server knows it's a Boolean. So let's go ahead and change that. It's important that with the data logger, there's a lot of different things to be aware of. So, you know, even your teacher sometimes can miss a step. So let's go ahead and start that again. We've saved, we've made our change. There we go. You know what? You know what we'll do, because it wants to be that way today. We'll actually skip it on the write back for now, and I'll get with that in a second. What I'm more interested in really is just the trigger. The trigger condition is what's really powerful. Again, the write back can be good. Not certain why it's being this difficult today, but save that. That being said, trigger, gonna fire the group log. So let's go ahead and do that one last time. Save our configuration. Again, always make sure to save after you apply changes. Okay, so we're back here again. We've connected to our Azure database, and I'm going to go ahead and actually, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write this value back to 0, because it's going to be a change, an on data change. Now this will go high. Everybody note the time. All right, 11:35.33. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and stop our test run for the moment. Let's go back to SQL Server Management Studio. Again, we're going to query the top 1,000 rows. And then if we scroll to the bottom, you can see 11:35.
Yep, I see 1133s in there, Tyler. You look up to rows 73 and 74. Is that the one?
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So we logged everything then, should have. Okay.
Yeah. And on your write back, you may want to try true.
I was thinking the same thing. So let me go ahead and do that. Item's still the same. Let's give that one more shot. At the end, we should have basically a perpetual cycle of acknowledgement that the write has been completed. So let's do that. Okay. We'll go ahead and do one more test just to make sure. Interesting. Perhaps we're having something going on with the device. We can deal with that a little bit later.
All right. I don't want to distract you, Tyler.
No worries. So it's important, like I said, make sure you walk through everything. And so we'll actually go ahead and stop that at the moment. That being said, though, again, there's always something to keep an eye on out for, and you want to make sure that your configuration is as robust as it can be. Those are the basic components of building a data logger project. And again, the writebacks can be extremely useful. I think that kind of covers the basics of configuring a data logger project. Obviously, there's a lot more that we can do. As you saw, there's trigger points just about everywhere in this project that you can use to manipulate how you want to log data, when, and such. And a lot of times these data-ready triggers are used by customers looking for some sort of validation coming from the PLC to go ahead and log. With that being said, I'd like to go ahead and open the floor up to any questions or perhaps some input from the panelists.
There is one that came in here right at the beginning when we were setting up the OPC UA connection, Tyler. If you don't mind opening that back up when we set up your UA security mode. That security drop down, are those security policies read automatically, or is that a predefined list from somewhere?
That's a good question. So these are actually pulled from the input themselves, and so they're actually read automatically. So like I was saying, sir, earlier, the install top server that I've got, I've actually taken all the encryption off. I've taken off the user authentication. And so this is actually what's being reported back to us from the top server, and the data logger lists it automatically. That's a good question. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. That's a good question somebody had there. Appreciate you sharing that. If you want to try this out at home or office, if you're lucky enough to be in the office, a couple of us are today. We came in to do this event versus remote working. You can download a trial version of the data logger that works for 2 hours at a time for up to 30 days at the link here. This will also be included in the follow-up email that we send you. If you have questions, here's how you can reach Tyler, Mark, Wynn, our whole technical team here.